so let me start with the speaker, respected Professor C. Raja Mohan, members of the Diplomatic Corps, scholars, practitioners, journalists, students, collaborators, friends from all over the world. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the Franco-German Observatory on the Indo-Pacific, a joint initiative by CERI and GIGA. This is the first session, and we are especially honored to have with us today Professor Raja Mohan as our inaugural speaker. Before introducing our esteemed speaker, let me say just a few words on the motivation behind this idea. The Indo-Pacific is very much on our minds in Europe at present. France has led the way in Europe by developing a systematic Indo-Pacific strategy. Germany came up with its strategic guidelines in September 2020. And just last week, I had the opportunity to speak with the German Federal Minister of Defense, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, on how she sees Germany's role in the region. And this interview will be aired soon as part of the RAICINA dialogue, organized by the Observer Research Foundation. The Netherlands, as many of you know, have also presented their own strategy on the Indo-Pacific, and preparations for a European strategy are underway. And while there is a lot of interest in the West on the differences and the commonalities among these different strategy positions, Christophe Jaffrelot and David Kamprou at CERI, and Patrick Koellner and I at the GIGA, and our teams wanted to learn more about the views and approaches of the various actors within the Indo-Pacific itself. So let me hand the floor over to our partner in crime at CERI, Christophe Jaffrelot, who will tell us a little bit more about the initiative. Over to you, Christophe.
Thank you very much, Amrita, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or even good evening. A few words, indeed, to present our Franco-German Observatory of the Indo-Pacific. As Amrita has just said, this concept, the Indo-Pacific, is today structuring the geopolitical discourse in the West. And the US showed the way. Everybody remembers when the title of the United States Pacific Command was changed into United States Indo-Pacific Command. And as Amrita has just mentioned, France showed the way on the European side with Emmanuel Macron's speech in May 2018 in Garden Island in Sydney. Last year, Germany and then the Netherlands formulated their own vision of the zone. But as Amrita mentioned also, in the West, there's been a kind of oscillation between two poles, you can say. And for Donald Trump, I'm sure everybody remembers that it was a question of building a coalition committed to a policy of China containment. Whereas for France and Germany, it's more a question of ensuring that international law is respected in the region. And that objective, of course, may coincide with China containment, but not necessarily. The thing that was not dealt with so much, and that this observatory is interested in cater to, is indeed, we do not ponder upon sufficiently on what does the Indo-Pacific means for the countries of the Indo-Pacific. And this series of webinars is precisely intended to deal with this question. So we will invite every month an expert of the region to present his or her country's views of the Indo-Pacific. Professor Raja Mohan today about India, Rory Metcalf about Australia next month. And the presentations will be designed, first of all, to understand how the Indo-Pacific is locally conceived as a region as a geostrategic construct in the first place. But of course, questions of economic dependence, of interdependence, with a focus on not only trade and investment, but also industrial cooperation, the building of infrastructure. These issues will be taken care of also. And as Amrita was saying, this is a joint venture, a project that has been initiated by two long-term European partners, GIGA and CERI-CNRS, and it is a long-term project too, because this series of webinars is the cornerstone of an observatory of the Indo-Pacific that is intended to be a hub for research. I would say at the intersection of international relations and area studies. I do not say more. You will find more information on the websites of GIGA and CERI if you're interested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Christophe. I hope I think that was a very nice summary, a succinct summary of what we're trying to do together. And I hope we've gotten many of our audience hooked. And you will be joining us, dear audience, in the events that we're doing and the research that we're developing together. And now for the proceedings of the day. Today we have almost 400 registrations, which is very much a credit to the high quality of our inaugural speaker, Professor Raja Mohan. Professor Raja Mohan is Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Earlier, he was professor at JNU and at the Rajaratnam School in Singapore. Professor Mohan is one of India's leading commentators on India's foreign policy. He has been associated with a number of think tanks in New Delhi, including the IDSA, the Center for Policy Research, and the think tank that I have a particular affection for, that I am affiliated with, the Observer Research Foundation. Professor Mohan was also the founding director of Carnegie India. He has held the Henry Alfred Kissinger Chair in International Affairs at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. He has served on India's National Security Advisory Board. He has led the India chapter of the Pugwash conferences. I could go on and on. His recent books include the beautifully titled and richly analyzed Samudramanthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, and also Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence. We've been reading his analyses in academic journals and also key newspapers and other outlets. It's great to have him here with us today. Professor Raja Mohan has kindly agreed to address us for 20 minutes. You will have the chance to ask questions, and you can do this either by using the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can pose your questions in writing via the Q&A function. You can pose them as we progress. You don't have to wait, especially for the written questions. You can pose them as we progress. You don't have to wait for Professor Mohan to end the lecture. If something comes to your mind, I will be reading out some of them at least after his input. And so without further ado, over to you, Professor Mohan. We are greatly looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Professor Narlikar, for that generous introduction. It's a delight to be with you and so many, Dr. Christophe Jaffrelot and so many other European friends. So I've been a particular Europhile, shall we say, in the last few years, trying to see how do we get Europe back to the east of Suez. So this observatory is going to help in that. It's a great initiative, so let me wish you all success. As the question of the notion of Indo-Pacific here to stay, the question of Europe's role, I mean, is quite clearly in the front and center today. And it's part of the larger, I would believe, that Western encounter with the Indo-Pacific, and that this is a new phase in the Western encounter with this region. And unlike in the past, the region has greater agency today. So therefore, I think it is wise of you to look at how the region looks at this whole set of debates. And the fact that today there are new powers in the region, that the nature of the contestation, the nature of the geopolitics is going to be very, very different from what we've known in the past. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I would like to make 4 sets of points. The first two relating briefly to the geography and economics of the current Indo-Pacific debate. And then the next two focus on the questions of strategy and contestation that come in, and conclude with a brief review of India's new strategic orientation in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll focus more on the second two elements and not the first two I'll briefly mention there. And I'm not focusing exclusively on India. I thought it's important to understand the larger dynamic in the region. First, briefly on geography and nomenclature. I mean, there is quite a bit of a debate all the time in terms of what is Indo-Pacific, where does it begin, where does it end? I mean, this debate we've had about Asia, this debate had always been there about Europe. But what I would like to state here is the regions are not static. I mean, the politically constructed regions are not statics. They keep changing in time. It's important to, for example, to recognize that things like East Asia, Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia are all fairly recent constructs. I mean, the region itself did not change, but how we think about the region, the nature of the political and economic forces that operate in this region change the monikers and the way we frame and think about these regions. If you just go back 100 years, there was Japan, there was China, there was Indochina, there was Dutch East Indies, there was the Indian subcontinent. But many of the terms that came in later, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, were all fairly recent categories. For example, I mean, I could say when many of my friends in Southeast Asia are surprised when I tell them, the first time the term Southeast Asia was used was when the Southeast Asia Command was set up by Lord Mountbatten to push the Japanese out of Asia. I also remind them that the Southeast Asia Command was in a place called Kandy, which is in the heart of Sri Lanka. So it tells you something that that the notion of what we think today, what is the conventional wisdom today, we must continuously be critical and question how we frame the regional definitions. One other example from 70 odd years ago, what was called the Burma-China-India theater, that when the Chinese had occupied, the Japanese had occupied Burma, that the contestation that took place, it was the Indian Army supported by the US Army, supporting the Chinese nationalist forces out of bases out of India, and to work together to push the Japanese out of Burma, including hand-to-hand combat in northeastern India. And nearly 1 million Indian troops participated in that war. And one of them, I mean, they were African troops, and one of them was one Mr. Obama, whose grandson would later become the president of the United States. And it was Obama's grandfather who came as a cook with the British Indian Army because Britain had fully mobilized all its colonies to deal with the challenge that it confronted in Burma. So I think the cast of characters today, if you think of the region, it is China, Japan, India, US, Britain kind of you can think of subsumed by US, but nevertheless, the characters have not changed. So I think it's important to remember this, that it was only 75 years ago. So when we think of Europe and the Indo-Pacific today, I think it might be useful to frame it. I mean, Suez to Shanghai, or even more interestingly, the Réunion Island to Okinawa Island kind of captures the geography. So you can choose your definition, but this is a large theater within which the various subregions are going to operate in any case. Second, I think on the question of economics, which is, it's really the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is quite clearly the focus. But if you think of the spectacular, nature of the Belt and Road Initiative, it's easy to forget the original European effort. As European capitalism came to the East, the importance of connectivity, importance of new rail corridors, the importance of building new cities like Bombay to Shanghai. Most of the cities did not exist before the European encounter. Building up of the shipping routes, the creation of various nodal points, the creation of standards. Today we talk about China's digital Silk Road, but the but the laying of the undersea cables, which revolutionized communication, was as much of a transformation. And all this was done under the expansion of European capital. So for all the greatness of the Chinese initiative, I keep reminding my Chinese friends, so heard of Suez Canal. That was dug by the British and the French, which connected two great seas. So there have been gigantic projects before. I think we should not be dazzled by that. But the important thing is to see the transformation of the capitalist forces in this region, the rise of local capitalism, which is Chinese capital in particular, how it is trying to transform the region. So I would say, looking to the European past in Asia might offer some interesting clues to Asia's future and under Chinese capitalism and the kind of contestation that is beginning to emerge. China is certainly not the first capitalist power to rise out of the East. Japan had that honor. And Japan too challenged the existing order that the West had constructed, and that China is doing something similar, but on a scale and in the kind of resources that it can bring to this contestation. So that's what makes a difference. So the Indo-Pacific then is as much about a contestation of capitalisms. When we talk about new supply chains, we talk about decoupling, we talk about new standards. So the full set of issues in terms of the different groups of capital contesting with each other. Now, just a few years ago, we believed there would be no contest between the various capitalist groups, and that it is going to be one happy harmony and integration through WTO, through a set of global rules. That system is quite clearly breaking down. That brings me to the question of strategy, which I think I want to spend a little time on this one before I go to the question of India. When putting Indo into the Pacific, I mean, to summarize the whole Indo-Pacific debate, it's about the centrality of India in producing a new balance of power that has been disturbed by the dramatic rise of China in the last decade and more. So you can fudge around it, you can dance around it. The Chinese are coming into the Indian Ocean. Indians have a stake in the larger stability in the Pacific. So therefore, the introduction of Indo is the recognition that the old alliances and structure are not adequate to deal with the rise of China. And I think that's why the importance of putting India into it, and the question of the Quad and other related. But here I must say something to Christophe. Look, I don't think anyone is talking about containment in this part of the world. It's about balance. I don't think China can be contained. China is too big, too large, too powerful to be contained. What is being debated is about the question of balance. How do we produce a balance that it does not, that we don't get smothered by a unipolar moment in Asia dominated by China. So as we look to the future, I mean, I think at least one important question comes to mind. What is the role of the West? Can the West undertake a united approach to this region? I think we've seen Trump try and do it unilaterally. We've seen President Biden trying to do it, mobilizing the whole of the West together to deal with this part of the world. An united West might be ideal, but I'm not sure if it is realizable at all. I mean, forget the near future. Differences in the West between the US and Europe, and within Europe, on how to deal with the China question are real. I mean, I think you all know more about it than me. When Europe's formulation that China is an economic competitor, a systemic rival, and a partner on global issues. I like this formulation because it's so elegant. But managing the competitive imperatives emerging from these three elements of this beautiful formulation are going to be anything but elegant. So I think, so therefore the questions of how the emergence of a powerful actor in the East, how the West is going to deal with it, is by no means settled. There is, of course, the German question. In a European forum, I don't want to get into trouble by raising questions of the question of Germany and Germany's attitude to this part of the world. But I think it partly symbolizes the problem of coming to a coherent approach to the challenges that the Indo-Pacific presents. Equally important, I think, is the fact that the West is spooked by the Russia question. in dealing with the Indo-Pacific. So I think that takes us to an age-old contradiction, that is that the Western focus on Russia, both Tsarist Russia, Soviet Russia, this Russia, at least many of us in India feel that has given China cut China a lot of slack. And that problem of how much resources does Europe devote to the China question and security in the East, when it sees a growing threat from Russia, that problem is there. And I think that debate, has barely begun. Those who were critical of the Indo-Pacific in Europe see that problem. And the larger question, I think, is Asia-Europe tension that existed in a much broader form. For example, through the Great Game, the question of the European rivalry, how it intersected with their expansion and competition in Asia was one question. Even Soviet Union, under Lenin, the question of, do you prioritize the European revolution, or you set the East ablaze by mobilizing the masses of the East to revolt against Western colonialism? 100 years ago, the Baku Congress. So that too, that question has not disappeared for revolutionaries anyway. And then the Second World War, at the end of it, the question for the Americans, were they going to support Asian nationalists against European colonialism, or they're going to cut them slack in order to focus on containing Soviet Union in Europe? So while Asian expectations about American support for their national liberation rose, but US chose, at least for a short time, to focus on NATO, the creation of security against the Soviet threat in Europe. So I think this problem of how do you balance between the two theaters now gets posed in multiple ways. Many of you might recall Europe's resistance to Obama's pivot to Asia. And today, the problem of limited resources and the distribution to deal with the China question and the Russia question will be with you. And that becomes even more harder as China and Russia draw closer. The other day, Lavrov was in Delhi saying that, look, China-Russia relationship has never been as close as it is today, while denying it's a military alliance. I mean, that can take you back into an academic inquiry of the continental challenges versus the maritime ones. This again, I think these are familiar debates, but they come back today in a very different and much more very interesting form. That brings me to the last question on India and India's approach to the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I would say, to simplify, that the Indo-Pacific has become the template for India's reconnection with the West. That one of the great consequences of the post-war situation, where India consciously dissociated itself from the central role that the British India, the Raj, played in securing the East, whether it is as a center of the region's economic globalization, as a center of providing security. Nehru consciously chose to withdraw from this role for various reasons. We don't have to go into that. But the fact is, India withdrew from the collaboration with the West, and much of the security institutions that were constructed in this part of the world were really attempting to substitute the vacuum created by Indian withdrawal, whether it is SEATO, CENTO, you can say even the FPDA that the British have constructed, the five-power defense arrangement. Many of these were because India said, look, we're not going to do what the previous 200 years, what India did in the East. So, but India went with the notion that there is, shall we say, the myth of Asian unity. I mean, I think when we talk about Indo-Pacific, this notion that somehow Asia is united, it's an illusion that has great appeal in Asia. And many Europeans tend to take it for granted. The Japanese use that slogan, Asia for Asians. The Chinese sometimes use it today. But I think what little value for that is, I mean, I think it is today buried in the waters of Western Pacific or the Great Himalayas. So I think anyone looking at this region is not going to be united. And how the region relates to the West, how the region intersects with the West today in dealing with the internal divide that is being produced by the rise of China. That is the central question. And I think that's where that India today sees that what India stood for once of distancing itself from the West, today sees a partnership with the West as central to securing its interests vis-a-vis China. that threatens its interests in the Himalayas or in the larger question of the Indian Ocean, South Asia. So we could argue about it. But the fact is, if the argument about strategic autonomy was used in India to keep India distant from the West, to the very logic of strategic autonomy, the very logic of seeking a multipolar Asia demands that India must seek to balance China to the extent that it can. And the gap between the power gap between China and India increases, the compulsion for that balancing strategy continues to grow. And that's what we'll explain to you. And the West, I think, after prolonged hesitation, certainly the US, has made that move to be able to see India as a critical partner in shaping the future of the East. What seemed a hesitant start under Bush acquired finally some momentum under Obama and Trump. And today, it's very much part of the American enthusiasm for India, the Quad, and a range of other issues around it. So India will hope that it is not just an India-US enterprise, and that it would need to see Europe play a much larger role. Of course, you can be like Stalin and ask how many divisions does the Pope have? How many ships can Europe bring to this part of the world? Even the most active France, I mean, there are limits how much you can do. But unlike Stalin, I mean, I think it is possible to argue Europe brings a lot more than military power. That it brings in the question of its soft power, the question of normative issues, diplomatic strength. So I think, as I see, Europe playing a larger role in the Indo-Pacific. It need not all be military, that even a limited military contribution would be of great assistance, value to this region, at least for India. And therefore, seeing Europe do more in Asia, for a former colonial country, this looks quite outrageous. I mean, for many people had given up on Europe in Asia, and Europe itself had withdrawn from this part of the world. But today, I don't see how we can construct a balance in the East without some participation of Europe and European institutions, European resources, and European power in the most broadest form that you can define. So I would see, therefore, and for India, having Europe in gives us room to not to be at the mercy of just US and China. That is, that with the domestic politics in both countries playing a large role, with the temptations of G2 forever being there, that Asia is not going to be left at the mercy of just US and China will decide the future of this region. Having Europeans there, having Japan, Australia, and others playing a larger role will give us more stability, in a system that is increasingly has the danger of, going back to a G2 or a bipolar confrontation. So having Europe then makes big sense for India. And in the end, this is really about the waters of Eurasia. And if you think of the Indo-Pacific as the waters of Eurasia, and where Europe, with its large amount of, a range of strengths that it has, will need to play a role in this part of the world, because the idea that Americans are going to secure this forever for the next 75 years, as they've done for the last 70, is not sustainable. Therefore, if Europe is willing to pick up more of the burden, and India that aspires to play a larger role, together we can make it easier, once again, to balance, to produce a balance in this part of the world. And I think that's where India, I suspect, that it's not fully understood. Let me conclude with this thought, that India is far more open to engaging Europe today. And we've seen already in the case of France, and I'm hoping Prime Minister Johnson's visit to India, we might see some progress. So for the first time in Delhi, I can see Europe is acquiring a weight in India's worldview. And I think studying that, of tracking that, could be a very, very profitable enterprise and a very stimulating inquiry in the coming days. So let me stop here. Thank you all for your attention. And once again, congratulate GIGA and CERI for starting this European Observatory of the Indo-Pacific.
Professor Raja Mohan, thank you very much. That was an absolute tour de force. And in those 20 minutes, you have given us so much food for thought. So some of the very important messages that I took away were how you talked about the regions being political constructs, And we should be aware of that. They don't fall out of the sky. The regions are there, but they're political constructs. You talked about we should be looking at the European past to see its future in the region. It's not just China that has had elaborate infrastructure projects in the region. Very importantly, and a point that often we in Europe and very much so in the US, that we miss out on, is it's very easy to talk about containment from the US in a region that is still, relatively speaking, in the mind far away. Whereas you talked about this is not about containment, but balance, right? That's an extremely important point that you have alerted all of us to. The Russia-China question and limited resources, and how Europe is going to try and balance this is going to be a very tough balancing act. And we see these debates playing out in a big way in Germany. You talked also about there is a real problem. We at the GIGA work on the Global South, and we often see the Global South being presented as one unified, non-democratic entity, which is just completely ridiculous. And you blew that myth in a very significant way right now when you talked about Asia United as a myth buried in the Great Himalayas and in the Indo-Pacific. So there's lots of food for thought. I have many questions, and with Christophe and me having the privilege of chairing the session, maybe abuse our positions with just maybe one question for me and one question for Christophe, if that's okay. So I'll ask you my question. The Quad, you referred to the Quad. And this is something that had really irritated China. We saw reports that China was saying this is going to disappear like sea foam. The Quad has not disappeared like froth in the sea. It's become stronger. But India's position is quite, in some ways, a precarious one there. Because of those four, India is the only one with no security guarantees and with China on its borders. So what are the risks? What potential do you see for the Quad? How should India be playing this game? And maybe Christophe, we can combine our questions?
Yes, of course. Two quick points, really, 2 sentences. Raja, do you think that India is now prepared to have allies and not only partners among the European and American powers in the Indo-Pacific? And as a corollary to that, is India envisaging a role for Russia in the Indo-Pacific? And how do you connect the two if this is the case?
Yeah, no, I think very good questions. I mean, I think I would say on the Quad, I don't think India is in a precarious position. Actually, India is in a controlling position, you could say. As the only non-treaty ally in the Quad, I mean, India is going to set the pace of progress in the Quad as a collective, because if the Americans want to do things with Australia and Japan on a 2+2, whatever formats they have, they can easily do it. So by having India in actually gives India a much larger agency in constructing this arrangement, rather than one, we're doing it out of fear of vulnerability. So I'm not very, worried about Chinese statements, but Chinese always draw a red line right in front of your house, so you can't do anything. So that's part of the propaganda style, then we got to accept it. So, but I don't see if I can sit with the Russians and the Chinese in a BRICS and RIC, why I can't sit with, US and Japan and Australia in another forum. And I think India's presence in the Quad also makes it that this is not outsiders against China. It is not about non-Asians against China. This is about Asian concerns, having Japan and India there and Australia. Well, I mean, you could, on a good day, you can think of them as Asians these days, because a lot of Indians and Chinese out there. So this is a regional coalition with Americans being there to help it. But I would say, so this breaks through a lot of traditional myths, and I think that's where it's going to be useful. But there is a threat on the ground facing India. But I think it has shown that, look, India did not seek it didn't expect the Japanese troops, of course, they don't move very far, or American troops to show up on the Himalayas. We still have the capacity to deal with those challenges. I think it is a question of India's power being strengthened, not that, and their position, I think, that is the strategy. I mean, I think so far so good. Where it goes is a different question. On Christophe's question, does India have allies? I mean, I would love to see what happens when Prime Minister Modi visits France again. Sometimes we say France is the new Russia for India. That France is a solid supporter today for India. That when it, on many critical issues today, in the old days, India looked to Russia to look at who's going to exercise veto in the Security Council. Today, maybe India looks at France as well. So I think it is one of the less studied question of the expansive depth that has emerged in the India-French relationship. Christophe and I were involved with ORF in a dialogue. 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking about doing things together in the Indian Ocean. That is happening today. And I see this relationship going quickly and further. Next week, we have the trilateral with Australia. There's greater cooperation in the Southwest Indian Ocean. So I think it's just the beginning of a French connection, which long in the making, but I would say that finally Indians are beginning to appreciate France and what it can do. So I would think this is going to go quite far. On the question of India's alliances, look, I'm not the usual Delhi guys who tell you India doesn't do alliances. I think India does what it did in 71 treaty with the Soviet Union. It's an alliance-like relationship. But like all large countries, it is not going to be bound by an alliance kind of thing. The moment the threat passed, India stepped back from Soviet Union, that it did not do the 10th anniversary celebrations. So I think, look, just as Mao Zedong leaned on one side to the Soviet Union in the 1950s, and he leaned to the American side later. So I think India can make adjustments. This idea somehow is India is not a normal power. It doesn't do coalitions. It doesn't do alliances. This is a mythology that the Indian academic community, the think tank community created, and the West, I think, has absorbed it hook, line, and sinker, rather than seeing India's actions. India also had military treaties with its neighbors, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Nepal. Of course, they're all not in great shape these days, because India's power vis-a-vis China has declined. But the fact is, India did those treaties. So it is not, and Nehru was offering security guarantees to the smaller neighbors when communist China entered Tibet. That was a classic balancing. That was classic security provision. So India today proudly says we'll be a net security provider. So I think we'll see more of that, but in India's own style and not in the way that we will get closer to many Western partners. So we will also do stuff on our own of security providing to various countries in this part of the world, what we're doing in the various island states. That's just the beginning. So I would say this is a different India. And I think those who study India's foreign policy need to break out of the old shackles that have actually obfuscate seeing what India has done in the past and what it does now in a much more vigorous fashion.
Okay, thank you very much. There are already a lot of questions that are here that are coming in writing. And I see Delphine Allais has a question in writing, but Indy, why don't you give the mic to Delphine Allais, because it would be nice to have to also hear questions at times. So, and don't be shy if people want to ask questions, just use the raise hand function. We are looking at you. Indy, can you hand the mic?
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me? Yes.
Very well. Very well.
Very much. Well, thank you very much, Prof. Raja Mohan, for your presentation. I found it very thought-provoking. So you mentioned that India is now ready to have an increasing amount of relationships with Europe. And to perhaps expand a little bit the reflection, I was wondering to what extent you would consider that India's relationship or its approach towards smaller regional powers, especially individual Southeast Asian states or the ASEAN as an organization, has changed? Has it evolved in light of the emergence of an Indo-Pacific strategy? And has it also evolved in light of the fact that Europe is also increasingly present in the region and increasingly entertaining closer relationships with smaller Southeast Asian powers as well?
You want me to answer right away, or you want to?
Well, if you're happy to answer this right away, because that was
no, if you want to take a few, yeah, that's better. Sorry, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, okay, very good. So Nicholas Larel, would you like to ask your question? And maybe if you could be a little bit brief, and then we can collect a few. Nicholas.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, thanks, Dr. Rajamohan again. Great discussion. I wanted to ask, when it comes to India's engagement with Europe in the Indo-Pacific, I would like to push you a little bit more how you think this work out in the context of the EU as an institution, which itself is trying to define an Indo-Pacific strategy. We see Joseph Borrell mentioning it a few times. Many of the cited examples of European collaborations in the Indo-Pacific are bilateral discussions, exercises, notably with France. And India has traditionally privileged bilateral channels. So do you see actually in the last few years and in the future a change in the nature of direct engagement of the EU? And is there potential for more institutionalized and substantial cooperation with Brussels? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Mohan, why don't you take those two sets of questions, because they were unpacked.
Yeah, no, just to start with the second question. I mean, look, EU is not a strategic actor yet. I mean, hopefully we'd love to see it one day, but at this point, it is not a security actor. Its strength is on the economic side. So India needs to get its economic act together with the Europeans. Hopefully we'll get forward on the trade and related issues. But on the political side, EU politically it's an important actor. So EU is on the political side, and the security cooperation is largely with countries like France and Britain, I'm sure. When Boris Johnson comes, hopefully we're going to do more with them, the two main European military actors. So we're going to do more with them. But I think India should engage. I mean, when they use POSCO, whatever you call it, European Defense Organization, there are a whole lot of issues between that and NATO. So India will wait for that. But meanwhile, the bilateral, what we can do with France and Britain will grow. And if Germany and others are interested in smaller kind of segments, in joint maritime initiatives, all that, I think India will be quite open to do that. But the focus clearly on the security side will be on the bilateral, and rather than on, because EU has nothing. And I have recently written about India engaging NATO. I think if there is one shop which I can deal with 30 countries, I should be jumping at the opportunity of taking it, and the military establishments of the whole of Europe. So I think India will need that conversation. We've also seen India in recent years, last few years, India joined the Alliance for Multilateralism with Germany and France. It has engaged the Nordic group, and there's going to be another Nordic summit. India has engaged the Visegrad Four. Historically, I've argued controversially that India has tended to see Central Europe through Russian eyes, but today India wants to develop its own approach to these parts. There are things to be done with the Euromed. There are things to be done with Portugal and Spain, historically, who have large global networks. So I think it's just the beginning. I said India's engagement with Europe is going to be exciting and multidimensional in the years to come. On the question of ASEAN, look, last 25 odd years, I think the one thing that has endured is the defense and security cooperation with various countries in the East. Certainly with Singapore, it's now almost 25 years plus where we do a lot of joint exercises with them. Vietnam, things have gone further. And on trade, we've had setbacks because India is not going to be part of the RCEP. But on the security side, there is a fairly robust engagement. And my sense is, can we expand that? Can we now work with Japan and Australia and eventually the US to do joint initiatives on capacity building, on those kind of areas? I think they all open up. But there, I think, as you all know, ASEAN is not united on the question of Indo-Pacific. Many of them are almost don't want to say anything about war, don't want to say anything about Indo-Pacific because the Chinese power is so overwhelming in the region. But I also believe that constructing a stable, a reasonable, credible alternative, and one where you can provide some alternatives, not just criticizing BRI, but if we can offer alternatives for the infrastructure construction, I think the region will be interested. But there is disappointment. We should not hide that on India's refusal to sign RCEP. But I would think there, the larger question of the the WTO globalization structure that has been created at the end of the Cold War, its own future is under question. And I think we got to take that into account. The state-market relationship is going to alter, I believe, under Biden. The question of France, of course, never left that model in terms of greater state role. So my sense is the presumption that, look, the whole world is going to be happily getting along under a single framework of globalization, I'm not sure that's going to sustain. So therefore, even on trade, I think there might be interesting opportunities for India to build strategic coalitions with Europe, with UK, with US, and with other partners in Asia.
Yeah. Actually, your point about the WTO, I mean, this, as you know, is a topic very close to my heart. I completely agree with you here, but there is also quite a different tenor of the debate in Geneva, which is, you know, the old globalization, reform, trade is essential. It's sort of almost two silos, right? There's security and there's trade. And so we need to have lots more conversations together. And NATO, your point on NATO, we had Jens Stoltenberg give a distinguished speaker lecture at the GIGA last year. And he was talking about a global approach, right? Where he was talking about embracing like-minded partners. And so this is also another conversation that maybe India should be having. And I was very happy to read your piece in the Indian Express on this. There are a few more questions, and I see Kate Anuban's hand up. So would you like to come in? And then maybe I saw Dr. Osterman's hand up, or you have it in writing, but if you like, you can also ask the question, Dr. Osterman. Okay. Kate Anuban.
Yeah, hello, thank you. Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan and Dr. Jaffrelot for this session. I have two quick questions. So one is, the way we know United States used Pakistan against Russia through Afghanistan and Taliban. Is this the moment similar where India will be used, let's say, against China to contain it or to balance? That's the first question. Can we make a corollary there? Secondly, in geopolitics, I know that morality and principles do not always gain enough attention or priority, but isn't it contradictory that India, which is turning undemocratic and authoritarian in the last 7 years, for example, under the Prime Minister of Mr. Modi, will be used by the West against China, which is so overtly is undemocratic. So don't you see a contradiction there? Thank you.
Should we collect a couple again?
Yeah, please. Okay. Yeah, please.
Dr. Osterman, over to you.
Yeah, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so Professor Mohan, thank you very much for your valuable insights into the current Asia-Pacific regional dynamics and Europe's possible role therein, which we've also, by the way, discussed quite a bit over the last days at ISA online this year. So as a constructivist, I like your point very much that you emphasize that neither region are actually coherent units, and especially Europe is not, given that it's not, as you have underlined in your answers to the question, that it's not a coherent security actor at all. So that's why I wonder whether you could elaborate a little more on the regional expectations towards European re-engagement. So would it really be interpreted as part of the US pole, or do regional countries see it as an independent actor or a coherent actor at all? So could we maybe also see some sort of free riding or exploitation strategies of some countries, or is it simply unlikely, given that any presence reining in or mitigating China's influence would simply be appreciated? So I'm really struggling with this exact role conception of regional countries for Europe. Does it extend beyond economics at all? Thank you.
Over to you, Professor Mohan.
Okay, I think on the question of India being used, I mean, come on, you know, we are a billion-plus country. I think this is the problem, you know, because in the West you think somehow you just come and use us. Look, I mean, even Pakistan was signed as Cold War agreements with the US, Seato, Cento, then cut a deal with the Chinese. So who was using whom? And then Kissinger uses Pakistan bridge to go to China. So I think you should give us a little more agency so that we're not a bunch of passive actors sitting there to be kicked around or moved. And in fact, if I'm facetiously, I might say, look, I thought I was trying to use Europe and the US to deal with the Chinese power. A lot of times I see in the American debate, they say, oh, we shouldn't be dragged into a conflict over, islands in Philippines by the Philippines against China. So I think, did the US use China to defeat Soviet Union? Or China benefited from that partnership? So I think we should get over this stuff that, look, as I said right in the beginning, look, region has agency. The West is weaker. So let's accept that as well, that it is not the same situation. So even in the peak power of the West, it could not simply use countries. The countries use the West as well. And I think the convergences, divergences. I think Modi democracy set of issues. I mean, Christophe writes more often. I rarely write on domestic issues. That's a debate for another day. I would say you talk to Christophe. But I would say this. You really tell me democracy was central to Western engagement with Asia? I've grown up in the 80s as a student, as a new researcher. American congressmen, Europeans come to Peshawar, stand there with the long beards, longer than mine, and say, these are the freedom fighters. And unleashed one of the worst anti-modernist, anti-misogynistic, worst creatures that were produced in our part of the world, and unleashed the religious violence. It was part of the Western strategy. So I think there should be some contrition, some sense of your own paths in the East. And now coming and sitting on judgment about Pakistan, about India, and say, are you guys democratic enough? And I'm going to judge you. I mean, I have judged you. Look, your past, if democracy was the criterion, why would US have a good relationship with Pakistan for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years? Why would US and China be partners against the Soviet Union? A communist China was America's partner in containing Soviet Union. So I think we should get over this and be a little more, at least we're in an academic setting, to see Western role itself in the developed world. Was it always somehow you came and promoted democracy? I don't think that's my sense of European history in the world. So I think we should be modest and also a little more circumspect in judging other people. There are problems, a lot of problems, but Christophe will be in a better position to talk to you probably about that. But I don't see Indian democracy is finished in just 6 years. I think India is too big for that, and too entrenched. So, but that's a debate for another day. On regional expectations of the EU role, look, I think the region is surprised, actually, the speed with which the Indo-Pacific debaters moved. Nobody benefited more than the US-China rapprochement in the 70s than Asia and ASEAN. Till this, Singapore was celebrating full diplomatic relationship with China last year. Can you believe it? That till the 90s, a lot of countries did not have formal diplomatic relationship with China. It was the change in the American approach to China, and it was kosher to engage China. After denying for many years, China did not exist, the PRC did not exist. And once US and China got together, we had Chimerica, we had the great economic integration. So the region benefited immensely. So for them, even to think about decoupling the tensions is a serious crisis for them. And they've really not thought about European role until now. So they're surprised what has Britain got to do with it? What has France got to do with it? But I think it's a learning experience. So it's here. Since you're a constructivist, I don't know, let me get this right. I mean, European role is what Europe makes of it. If Europe is serious, it can bring in more forces, can do more things with the region, do capacity building. If it works with Japan, if it works with India, I'm sure Europe can do more. But we're at the beginning of this process because it was seen purely in the US-China context. But now, Europe, I think, at least some like India, Japan is the one which has actually sought to draw France and Britain into this. So I think there is some countries are eager to have the US back because the more the merrier. And the greater the number of actors, it's probably easier to construct a balance and gives it some stability. But the region is surprised and they don't have great expectations of the EU. But now Britain is trying to do its things. France is doing something. So India, certainly we welcome Europe back into Asia. Colonial Europe, if you will, because that's, But it's a different Europe, it's a different Asia. So I think we should be able to find new ways of working together.
Okay, we have only 5 minutes left and a lot of questions. So may I just read out 3 questions to you from which have been typed in. The first one is from Isabel Sanitza. And she's asking, how do you see the role of the Andaman and Nicobar evolve as part of India's Indo-Pacific strategy? May New Delhi think of opening the ANI to foreign investments and major partners with which it has signed logistics agreements like France, US, Australia? Then there's a question from Michael Weiss, the second question, which is, does India intend to significantly strengthen BIMSTEC and its very slowly developing security component to balance China? And one from, there are lots of GIGA colleagues who had questions, but I'm just gonna have to take one written one now, which is from Andrew Crawford. And he's asking, you mentioned the historical strategic importance of Burma. Are you concerned about the current events in Myanmar destabilizing the region? If armed ethnic groups increased the intensity of the conflict or demonstrators took up arms, what do you think India's response would be? And may I add to that, should be? Thank you.
Okay, I think the Andamans, we, just as the Chinese, I think one good example is to see what Chinese have done with the Hainan Island, largely closed for decades, treated as a security zone, and then opened it up. And I think you can see there is a submarine pen as well as the dramatic tourist facilities that have been created in one island. India, of course, can't do the speed at which China does things. But I think India has slowly moved, certainly under the present government, under the Modi government, has begun to open it up. Nothing gets done in a hurry in India, but the basic attitude that it can't be a closed place, appreciating its strategic location, and to begin to draw economic cooperation. The Japanese have been very interested. France, for example, when I traveled to Réunion a couple of years ago, they were very interested in doing things on island development. So there is a lot of potential. I think there have been some reforms in the last 3-4 years, some opening up, some Indian capital is beginning to move there, setting up hotels. But we've also had to take care of the, large questions about the small tribal population, the green related issues. So, but it's just the beginning. There was a recent cable that was set up. So basically, first thing is to connect Andamans to the mainland, and then connect it with Indonesia, with Singapore, within the east, so that you begin to create new structures. But I think it is opening up. I think it's a story that's worth following. Anyone who's looking at the East. There are islands. We talked about Australia, France. I don't know, some of the islands related issues might come up next week. How do we develop these islands? Because the location makes it, and at the mouth of the Indian Ocean for the Chinese naval forces to come in, the huge number of possibilities that can be done on maritime domain awareness and related stuff. BIMSTEC, it's already 20 years old. It's struggling. The last few years, we've seen India put in new effort to develop it. But as you said, look, Burma, Bangladesh, back to fighting what used to be, we thought we could integrate the region. So the changes in Burma make it harder. So I'm not, it's not something that's going to set the world on fire. But the fact is, last 4-5 years, there's more effort on BIMSTEC, but it's going to be long haul. And my sense is it's still really, in the near term, it is what India does with the US and others. And the bigger task of how do we convince the rest of the region, look, this is not China containment. This is not a new Cold War. This is about creating alternatives. And I think that political task, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it is Indonesia, whether it is Singapore, a lot of work lies ahead for the Quad and for the West and India. So I think that process will have to continue. And I think that will be the driver rather than the small regional organizations that are simply going to shape the region. But the idea of Bay of Bengal, uniting Bay of Bengal as a geography is a good one. And I think some progress is being made. On the Burma question, look, I think it's a tragedy. Just when we thought things were stabilizing, and I think you're back to, but it's not an easy question. I think that takes you back to the democracy issue. That distance gives people, okay, you can sanction till the cows come home, but if the army does not step out, it does not mind paying the costs, So I think we are in a, this requires, I think, a lot of the traditional assumptions about punishing regimes, how do you promote democracy, the ethnic divisions within the country. So there are multiple challenges out there. And as someone said, Burma is ruled by a king and a queen, that is ASSK and the Burmese army, but they're not married to each other. So there are two strong forces which are trying to pull the country in a different direction. And you have the range of ethnic militias. So we are in it's a serious challenge, and there are not going to be no easy answers. If anyone thinks it's simply, you can just come and set the terms, it is not going to. I think the first task, at least some in Singapore have argued, restoring a civilian government as opposed to restoring democracy. Can we do that? Can we get some semblance of ending violence? And those require compromises, and moment you compromise, there are criticisms. So, but I would say, again, I think we need more modesty, more circumspection in dealing with the kind of challenges that emerge in this part of the world.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rajamohan. You have given us such great food for thought. We have to bring this session to an end, but this is not the end. This is only the beginning. And we look forward very much to engaging again with you, we hope, Professor Mohan. And as this is the inaugural session, you've really gotten us to a great start. You've given us lots to ponder over, and we will come back to you with more. And I just also want to reiterate my thanks to CERI, to Christophe. We at the GIGA are just delighted to be doing this with you and with all the team that forms a part of the Franco-German Observatory. So join us in future sessions as well. The next one is with Rory Metcalf, as Christophe said, on the 19th of May, and where we will hear more about many of the issues that Professor Mohan started talking about. So it's just now for me to say goodbye. Please stay safe and stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful being here. Yeah.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Amrita.
Thank you, Christophe. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.